Chapter 3, Mishnah 3. Someone who makes an Eruv tehumen does not need to put the food in exactly the place that he intends to designate as his new residence. As long as the food is accessible from the designated place during Ben Shmasos, twilight, on Friday evening, the Erev is valid. This Mishnah discusses some applications of this law. It starts with the case of a tree that is in a public domain. The person wants to establish his residence on the ground next to the tree in this public domain, but he put the food on one of the tree's branches. We now turn to the words of the Mishnah. If he put the food on a tree and it is above 10 tefachim, his Erev is not a valid Erev. This is because the food is in a private domain, and so it would be forbidden during Benish Masos to bring the food to the place in the public domain that he wants to establish as his residence. Since he cannot take the food at the necessary time, the Erev is invalid. However, if he put the food below 10 tefachim, his Erev is a valid Erev. The food in this case is not a private domain, but a carmelis. Carrying from a carmelis to a public domain is prohibited only rabbinically, and rabbinic prohibitions are lifted during Benish Mashos for the sake of making an Eruv tehumen. He is permitted, therefore, to take the food at the required time, which makes the Erev valid. The Mishnah now cites the law where someone wants to establish his residence in a carmelis, and he put the food in a private domain. If he put the food in a pit, even if it is 100 amos deep, his Erev is a valid Erev. The pit is a private domain, and he wants to establish his residence in the adjacent area, which is a carmelis. Carrying from a private domain to a carmelis is forbidden only rabbinically, and as mentioned above, rabbinic prohibitions are lifted during Bein Hashmashos for the sake of making an Eruv tehumen. The Erev is therefore valid, since he is permitted to access the food from his intended residence at the necessary time. The Mishnah presents another type of situation in which the food is in a place adjacent to the intended residence. If he placed the food on top of a reed or on top of a pole and he wants to make his residence next to the reed or pole, as long as the reed has been uprooted and is only stuck into the ground, then even if it is 100 amos high, this is a valid Erev. There's no problem of carrying in this case, because the top of the reed or pole is an exempt area from which carrying is permitted even under rabbinic law. Nevertheless, the Erev is valid only if the reed has been uprooted, because if it were still planted in the ground, taking the food from it would be prohibited for fear that one will break a piece off the reed, which is forbidden under the melacha of reaping. But if the reed is merely stuck in the ground and not planted, the concern is irrelevant and the Erev is valid. The Mishnah's last case involves food that is locked in a wooden cabinet. The lock is attached to the cabinet by a rope. If he put the food in a cabinet, locked the cabinet, and then lost the key, this is a valid Erev. Although he cannot open the lock, he can open the cabinet during Bein Hashmashos by cutting the rope with a knife. But Rabbi Eliezer says, if he does not know that the key is in its place, i.e. it might be lost, it is not a valid Erev. According to Rabbi Eliezer, it is prohibited to cut the rope with a knife. Therefore, if the key might be lost, the Erev is invalid.